Welcome, everyone, to today's conversation about microcredentials and how they fit into prior learning assessment. I'm really excited to have today's conversation with Emily Jones-Green and Charles McGinnis and diving into this really proliferation of microcredentials and what this means as we continue to support the adult learner and moving more talented individuals into new types of roles in the workplace. So let's start with some introductions. I'll turn it over to you, Emily, first, just to give us a little bit of background on you and how microcredentials are showing up for you.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Emily Jones-Green. I'm the coordinator of credit for prior learning with the Virginia Community College system. And I would say for micro-credentials and how they're showing up for us, I guess it all depends on how you define micro-credentials, right? Because there's lots of definitions out there. But for the Virginia Community College system, one of the ways they're showing up for us is our credit for prior learning with our short-term credentials from our Fast Forward programs. And those are programs that we offer through the workforce side of our community colleges, and we're evaluating them for academic credit on our academic side into specific academic programs. But obviously, there are other opportunities for students that may want to have additional credentials evaluated as well.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to join my colleagues this afternoon. I'm Charles McGinnis. I'm the Senior Director for Continuing Education at Goodwin University, and that says a whole lot about nothing. Basically, I've been in this field of work for the better part of almost 30 years. Yes, I'm getting old, but that's how it works. In particular, working with micro-credentials and short-term workforce training, mainly on the non-credit side, some articulations with credit-bearing degree-seeking students and programs. And really this, as my colleague Emily just pointed out, the whole micro-credentials, it all depends on what context you're talking about. Are you talking about a digital badge? Are you talking about a piece of a credit-bearing course? Are you talking about something standalone, perhaps a certification from a third-party agency that certifies and assesses for skills attainment? So it could really be all over the board. And most of what we do is all over the board. I think Emily probably doesn't have the same day twice in a row ever. And so that's kind of our experience with micro-credentials. Here at Goodwin, we're exploring how to make it fit more, talking about internal articulations again, some standalone, some employer partner engagement, specifically for those opportunities, and particularly the utilization of contract training and getting those going. We are in the process of implementing digital badging for our short-term workforce as well.
Great. So let's just stay on this topic of definition, right? So maybe because it's so fluid in what they are, is there a unification, or do you see any sort of movement into micro-credentials actually provide this value proposition? Is that the unifier?
You know, I've heard it described as the Wild West, and I don't think it's quite that chaotic. There are some pockets, I think, of unification attempts going on. I know there's some good work in a number of states. Iowa's doing some really good stuff. Of course, Virginia has an excellent model and a great system there where Emily's at. Heard some things in Maryland, and I've personally worked in both Carolinas, Florida, California, New York, and now Connecticut. And honestly, we tried to do some of that while I was in New York through a statewide organization that was bringing together the SUNY and CUNY systems. But even between those two very geographically closely related systems, but vastly different in scope, there wasn't a lot of yes and yes. We both use that same. So I think the definitions are still to be determined. And I think we're seeing some pushes through some major partner players, UPSIA, for instance, in trying to bring together the disparate pieces, whether it's nationally here in the United States, but even internationally, and what it means for the online world and what it means for our efforts more locally on the ground here in our respective areas. So I think you're going to see more push for that as time goes on. And your word introducing this, Jesse, was the proliferation of microcredentials. And it's really true. Everyone wants to use that term. It's very trendy. It's very contemporary. It catches attention, the buzzword, if you will. But what it actually means and how we put it into play is so varied. And it's a work in progress.
And it really seems like that lack of definition or standard. And then how does everything relate to each other? Emily, have you been able to kind of navigate or pull that string of like, how do four credentials that actually have the same title, how are they valued? Or, how do you unwind that even for, let's say that the learner can figure it out, but for faculty as they're thinking about prior learning assessment?
Well, I think you also just hit on something, and that is it's even causing confusion with faculty because there are so many different titles of certifications and what the outcomes are, the seat time for the students or the learning time of the students. And I think just overall, the confusion is across the board between the student and the faculty and those of us that are even trying to wrangle it and make sense of what it is that we're trying to help do. But I do think one of the unifying pieces is that the goal is that it should be stackable. We want to make sure that there is a progression for the student, but it needs to make sense. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that all of the information we have up front when we're presenting it to the faculty for evaluation is there so that we're not playing catch up and trying to, provide extra information for the students on the back end. But I do think, between the micro-credentials, badging, workforce certifications, industry certifications, if we could just come up with those pieces that we could provide a pamphlet for faculty or, a website that says this is what we're doing. And even in preparation for today, I saw that UPSIA had even presented a poll about what should we be calling these things. And so, I think once we get that information out there, the clarity will come, and then we'll be able to provide better information for students and for faculty to provide that pathway and that progression.
Yeah, Emily, I couldn't agree more. And I'm glad you threw the word in there toward the end of pathway, which is what we're really trying to create. And pathways are not one-way streets. And it's really which pathway into the university or the college or the system are the students taking, then which door are they exiting? And are they exiting towards more continued education? Did they start in a non-credit track, progress into a college credit certificate, or even a degree-seeking track? Did they go to one or the others and then exit into an employment track? And that's the other piece I wanted to bring to the discussion now is the confusion for the employers. What does a micro-credential mean to that university to business partner that you're working with, either to do customized contract training or to create a cohort model for a certification or a program for them? They're not sure what it means. So it's incumbent upon us to be very clear, as Emily put it, even to those employers, what this digital badge means, what this certification means. Because once you step outside of their own recognized industry credential, they're kind of lost. And it's no fault of their own. That's not their lane. That's really where we are in higher ed and what we should be doing. So it's really a basic tenet. It goes back to communication. It goes back to having the right definitions, talking the right language. And you have to change it up a little bit for your audience, employer versus faculty versus administrative staff, so on and so forth, and learner, of course. But in the end, we've got to communicate clearly. We've got to be very upfront and transparent. And we've got to listen before we communicate to make sure that we're not trying to tell the story for the folks who create the story.
On that point, Charles, so I know you've been creating some micro-credentials defined in a variety of ways. How are learning outcomes or measurements, like the actual learning assessment, how are you thinking about that? And do you take into consideration like the larger, what else is being offered in the market and you're trying to fill a gap, or are you trying to offer something at a lower at a lower price point or in a shorter amount of time? How are you thinking about that value prop?
In short, yes. Everything that you said, I mean, that's it. You covered it. It really is any number of those variables into varying percentage and degrees of how much of each one, sometimes more of the market placement, sometimes more of the assessment and value to the local employer, sometimes more to the outcome for the student. And frankly, if we're not doing some type of assessment where we're showing valued skill attainment, whether it's through testing and assessing in a more traditional academic way, or if it's more applied learning, practical hands-on assessment, skills training, and showing the demonstration of those skills, if you're not doing those, then the quality just in credibility, frankly, isn't there, in particular for the learner and for the employer. They've got to be able to see that. So we need to make it really easy to digest. We need to make it very clear and upfront. For the value proposition internally at the institution, for faculty, staff, administrators, why do we even start this path? Then for the learner, why would you take this path with us? Then for the employer, when we're doing that, what did these people we taught these skills, this program to, end up with to value add to your environment? And it's truly those milestone steps along the way that we need to continually encourage the learner. Short-term success. That's why the stackable comment that Emily made earlier is so important and vital to this process. My average learner is somewhere around 37 years old and about their third career move. And they don't think they can come back to university or college. That's not for them. I've been out of school for this many years, Charles. I can't do it. Yeah, you can. Get that short-term workforce credential, whether it's a digital badge or an industry certification, then parlay that into college credit certificate, then parlay that into degree-seeking opportunity. All along the way, internally, we've got to work those crosswalks and articulations. So how do we make sure the assessments in the short-term credential match into the program assessment and needs for outcomes? It's just that. It's working with faculty. It's working with program directors and managers to ensure that the skills attained here crosswalk over and equal the same outcomes here. And you may spend X number of hours or days or weeks or whatever earning that certification, and that may only translate into 1 to 3 credits. But you tell a learner that you just eliminated a class out of a whole series of classes, it's a pretty good step up, and it encourages them to take that next step and get into that further pathway progression that they would realize going beyond the initial certification.
Are you also building them, Emily, or are you? How does that show up in the work that you're doing? Are you following a similar model as Charles, or a little bit different?
So in Virginia, our short-term trainings or our fast-forward programs, looking at the value proposition, the colleges are looking at the LMI in their local area, and they have to prove that in order for a program to be running through our fast forward program. We do have short-term certifications that are not fast forward as well, but fast forward is also funded by the state. So the state will pay 2/3 of a student to go through a fast forward program because they're high demand industry areas that the state says we need workers in these specific areas. And so that value proposition is already there. We're working with employers as they are being developed. And then as part of the evaluation, when they're putting in an application for a new program, they are telling us this is equivalent to this academic course and it will be crosswalked into this program. And we are very intentional about that where it is possible, because then we can start marketing to the students from the minute they're starting in that program, in that fast forward program, and say, hey, we know this might not be what you want to do immediately after finishing this certification, but this is a pathway for you. You could consider this academic program. And we've built our system so that the colleges can create communications about, hey, credit for prior learning is an option. You don't know what that is? This is an opportunity for you to get credit for that workforce certification you earned at X college. And so that is something we're trying to be very intentional about, so that it will be part of their their experience from the minute they're enrolling in that short-term program.
The Fast Forward program is so interesting, right? It is like a true demonstration of workforce demand, get the upskilling in the moment, and it is a guaranteed job, or do they still have to go through another process to get the job?
They would still have to be hired through the company, but a lot of times those employers are working with the colleges to make sure that we're offering the program. So they have opportunities to come into the classroom and talk to the students about what their opportunities are once they've completed their certification. And they'll have hiring and career days on their campuses. So it's not a guaranteed job necessarily, but there is that need, that local need for those skilled workers in those areas.
The students understand that notion of credit for prior learning? Like, is that just already on their records? So if I go into the advisor and say, hey, I think I'm ready to go and get my associate's degree, or I want to do the 2+2 at Nova and Mason, is that already like mapped, or do they go through a process in order to get it evaluated for prior learning?
So we're working on kind of two tracks. One, that if a student earns their certification and they go into that specific program, that it would be able to show up automatically. But there are policy things that might need to change. For example, matriculation. What does it mean to matriculate? Some of the colleges have policies that say credit for prior learning won't be added to a record until a student has officially matriculated. Some colleges, that's after add drop or census date. Some, it's the minute they register. So there's some pieces across the state that we're also trying to tidy up so that it will make sense for the learner. But to answer your question, no, they don't know what credit for prior learning is. And that is something we're trying to also address through our communication, marketing communication, and making sure that that is one of the first conversations they have when they talk to the Fast Forward coach. And then if they when they finish that certification, they'll get that communication that says, congratulations, we're so proud of you. You're eligible for these credits, which is credit for prior learning that you could apply to specific programs.
Yeah, I have to echo with my colleague there. They really don't understand it. And then you explain it to them and they're like, oh, okay, aha. It really is a light bulb above the head moment. And it's really cool to see that. One of the most interesting things too is when you talk to that person who is a veteran and let them know that some of that military experience can count. Some of those trainings and educational opportunities they took advantage of while serving in the armed forces can count as well. The main thing with prior learning is just really awareness. And I think that's what Emily was hinting at and getting to the point rather she was getting to, is we have to, as educational institutions, educate and make aware of what those opportunities are, because we get a student in off the street and it's so overwhelming. It's great that there's lots of options, but it can be so overstimulating, overwhelming, and they get lost. And that whole matriculated, non-matriculated, program start, program end, prior learning, what? And so you just have to slow it down a little bit for them.
Yeah, this is too good to be true. They couldn't possibly do this, right? Or I hear that a lot. Like, colleges would never do that. No, they are doing it.
And it's not uniform. Also, to Emily's, it's not uniform any more than the definitions we started this conversation with. PLA could mean 12 different things at 12 different institutions. Mm-hmm. It could be some this, yes, that. What is counted at one institution may not be counted another. And that could even be within your own system, right, Emily? Yeah, so I had experience with that in New York because of a multi-school system. And it's like, that's great that you did that at one, but we don't do that here. And I'm sorry, it doesn't count. Then you go back to the student and say, well, your choices are now limited. So it's still, again, work in progress that in higher ed as we continue to grow and evolve, we'll come across these growing pains, for lack of a better term. And we're trying to work those out both systematically, down in Virginia, what Emily's going through, and even with a standalone institution like I'm at here at Goodwin. We hadn't been doing this kind of work prior to my arrival 2 years ago. So I'm having to do internal awareness and education as well, just so we can put the pieces in place to get to these students and then educate and make them aware as well.
And Charles just hit something. That is the awareness even within the college advising. And Jesse, you know this from our previous experience together. So much is put on advisors to be the all-encompassing person for our students. And it's impossible for advisors to remember everything. And because our working and our adult learners have so many pieces to their puzzle of their entire educational journey and their career, it is hard to make sure to remember, oh, let's have a conversation about credit for prior learning. Also, you're worried about childcare and possibly transportation, and you need online courses that are asynchronous and, are 8 weeks. So we're trying, we're trying to make sure advisors are aware of everything that the student needs in order to be successful. But we need to remember that, we need to do a lot of that communication up front for not just the students, but for the advisors, but making that awareness really front and center so that everybody is thinking about credit for prior learning or life experience, however we want it to be defined.
That those advisors are just a treasure trove of information, and you cannot code a technology to be able to pick up all of that nuance. Oh, you said this. Charles, is it easier coming into an environment where you're actually able to kind of lay the foundation? And you've done it in a couple of different ways. What are you seeing?
The word easy never comes up, regardless, to be honest with you. That's a really interesting, great question, Jesse. In some regards, it is easier because you have the quote unquote blank slate or clean palette or blank canvas to create on. But in that same instance, because it's blank and it was an unknown, you're having to lay the foundation yourself within your internal organization, which frankly has proven more challenging than working with the student community or the employer partner community or the community-based organization partner community, simply because you get a mindset, heaven forbid, and stuck in a way of doing things, and then lo and behold, there's this whole new way to do it. But wait, that doesn't fit our old way. So there are challenges to both. There are some things that are easier in a new setting versus an established, but absolutely better in an established setting because some of the supports are already built, some of the processes are already in place, some of the procedures exist. Some of the policies may have already been written. Do they need to be tweaked or updated? Sure, that happens, but that's just natural progression and growth. So it's really hard to say one is easier or better than the other. They both have the pros and cons. Unfortunately, even though almost 30 years, there's no magic formula.
I know.
Because the environment in the marketplace, if you will, changes so dramatically and rather quickly. Higher education typically is not a fast-paced, agile, moving entity. We like to measure our movements in glacial timing. So it's one of those things that to be quick and agile, like industry, for instance, advanced manufacturing, whatever industry, healthcare, even IT, obviously, we just aren't wired that way in higher ed because it's usually, well, what's the research? And then you test it out and then you build the assessment. And by the time you've done that, the industry's moved two steps further down the road. And so being in a continuing education department or division kind of scenario where I'm currently seated helps because I'm not worried about building a full-on academic degree program. I'm not asking for the participants to spend 18 months to 4 years of their life to get this accomplished. It could be a really short-term workforce turnaround, 9 months or less, typically align something within industry. So you hopefully are at Industry 4.0 or beyond before you finish and haven't got left behind. But even the IT certifications that are short term, by the time you come out with it, that next version 2.0 or 2.3 or 2.34569 is out there, and it makes it tough. So I like to stay with the non-credit. I like to stay with the short-term workforce because I can meet that individual's needs a little better. But there's value on both sides, and it's just, again, sorry, no magic recipe there.
Yeah. So as you're building out your courses then, or your short-term credentials or micro-credentials, are you then, as they go live, also getting buy-in from the faculty in the degree areas so that you're able to map them simultaneously, or is it a sequence?
Yes. It's going to be my favorite answer to you, Jesse, because there is no one tried and true manner, unfortunately. Usually you want to, at least that my experience has been, I want to try to do that work in alignment. I want to be doing both things at once. I want to be building that credential that the person needs maybe to go get a job quickly, but I also want to be having those conversations with a faculty, a program manager, a director, a dean, or whomever it may be, about, hey, this really great thing in your area, your field is happening. Is there some way we can align that? And we discuss outcomes, we discuss seat time, we discuss whatever. One of the, I guess, cool but can be problematic things in doing non-credit, you can get a subject matter expert to come in and teach your class. You're not reliant on a master's prepared in the field or master's plus 18 faculty for every single solitary thing you do. So that allows you to be a little more agile. But once you start talking about doing that articulation and crosswalk over, you got to make sure that it all adds up, because those regional accreditors won't like you very much otherwise. And so I see Emily shaking her head. I've dealt with Saks, I've dealt with Mid-Atlantic, I've dealt with Western, and now NECHI. So they all have a little bit of difference in intricacies within, but the overarching thing is that quality program, the rigor, the assessment, and being able to prove out what you're doing. And frankly, I would feel like I'm doing a disservice to my students if I'm not doing both things at once. And so I need to have that conversation on the back end. So when they finish with the one piece with me that they're doing, there is a next step if employment's not what they're seeking. They're like, well, great, Charles, what's next? And I need to have that answer for them.
So Emily, you and I have had some side conversations about, there are lots of partners that are providing micro-credentials in lots of different ways. Individuals are showing up on our campuses and saying, hey, I already have these micro-credentials, or, how are you navigating that? How are you determining which partners offerings that you want to have versus you need to have? And how do the employers kind of weigh in on any sort of decision that as you kind of think about the framework of accepting or not accepting credits?
That's a really great question. And, right now, if a student is showing up on any of the campuses, it's their autonomous decision. And so they would send it through their local credit for prior learning process for evaluation. And they would look at the outcomes and the seat time and see where it would actually have a natural match on the academic side. I think for some, it makes sense, but I also think sometimes students will just think that if they have a credential or if they have a certification that they're going to get automatic credit. And one of the things we've tried to make sure that both our faculty and the students know when we're talking about credit for prior learning is it needs to be applicable to the degree. So we're not going to give credit for something that is not going to make sense within their degree, just to give them credit, especially, on the associate side, they don't have a ton of electives that they may be able to apply to. So it really needs to make sense. And we are really looking at the rigor, how it would map, if it makes sense with the outcomes. And then as Charles mentioned, accreditation is a big issue that we want to make sure that we are adhering to what our accreditors are saying when it comes to transfer credit and credit for prior learning, because we don't want to do anything that would jeopardize accreditation. And so, the colleges will really take a deep look. We give all of the guidance on what they should be looking for when they send it through their process. And if it is something that they want to award that credit for prior learning, we make sure to encourage them to send it through their curriculum and instruction committees so that it would go on their books and it would be transparent and really part of that, not just the student record, but the institution's record. Employers, in terms of the credit for prior learning, they don't really play a part in that piece just because they're not the ones that have to answer to the accreditors or to the faculty in making those determinations of the credit for prior learning. But what we hope we can do kind of going forward is that employers could come to us and say, we're doing this really great training. We would love for you to evaluate this for any of your academic programs so that we can help our incumbent workers to get upskilled and continue on in our company. That's going to show that we value them, we value education, and it can be a whole cycle where we can tell our students or our incoming employers, hey, your next step is to go on to this role. We want you to go to this college and earn this degree, and that's going to help you get there. So that symbiotic relationship is very, very crucial, but not necessarily in the students coming in part, but we do want them to tell us when they're doing specialized trainings that we could evaluate. Same with any of the unions when they're doing trainings and any of their any apprenticeship. We want to that's happening outside of when we're doing the instruction. We want to make sure that we can have those evaluated so we can help those team members to come to us and get their additional education to continue upskilling.
Yeah, Emily just described the gold standard and the dream that we all want when it comes to that. We're doing some work with UPSIA now in U2B relations, prior learning leaders group through a Walmart Foundation grant and trying to better align and get a usable tool and to involve the employers more in anything that they can. To Emily's point, not with what we do or don't with prior learning. That's between us and the accreditors. But absolutely let them have a say. And maybe the new certification that we bring in, or if we can turn their training into a credit piece on our end somehow, that just only strengthens that bond and benefits the learner.
Question around if you could prioritize one thing at the intersection of microcredentials and prior learning that everybody could get on the same page and we would figure it out in April 2025, what would be the one thing that you would prioritize?
Gosh, there is a lot, but I think if we go back to even some of our opening commentary, if we could just get the definitions nailed down to at least closer than what they currently are, I think that would be such a huge advantage for everyone involved, whether it's learner, faculty, staff, employer, anyone who's going to be involved in this microcredential journey at all. If we could get some definitions in terms that are universal, and maybe that's too big, maybe we could, even if we could narrow it down to industry specific when we're talking about employer partners, that would be helpful. It could also be helpful to get within particular degrees across institutions. But then I remember Emily talking about her Virginia system, even school to school, it can be a challenge. But certainly starting with that definition, convergence, if you will, of this means this for everyone would probably be pretty, if not the top of my list, really near the top.
once you have those set definitions, a lot of the confusion will go away. And I think then we would be able to talk to students in a better way. We'd be able to talk to faculty, and it just have a shared understanding. Even trying to just do a quick Google search of micro credentials, the amount of hits that just end up causing more confusion, even for somebody that's in the higher ed space that's done credit for prior learning for a long time and worked at, several institutions. I'm like, what is happening? And I think if we could have those definitions, it would take away that confusion.
Quiet some of the noise that's out there, for sure.
All right. So what is one question that I didn't ask you that you think is really critical to this whole conversation around micro-credentials as they relate to prior learning?
One of the questions that I think is kind of helpful for us in Virginia in framing the conversation is we are doing a lot of work on trying to reimagine how we do the military credit. And I think I've spoken with you about that, Jesse. There's a lot of opportunity to think in a way that would provide our service members with more meaningful credit, especially knowing that a lot of our veterans want to go into a totally different field, and making sure that we're actually acknowledging the skills that they've acquired throughout their time in the service. But another thing in Virginia that we're really trying to focus on are the programs that we offer through our workforce arm, because those are the students that we know we can help. If they already are our students, and this is a way of helping them validate what they've done through the workforce, and then applying them to an academic program. So really showing them as the student that they have this entire pathway ahead of them and they have these opportunities, I think really is it's a great way, and it strengthens that relationship between the employer, the workforce, and the academic side, because they're really then working cohesively for the students and making sure that we are providing that pathway for them.
I can't say it any better than that, for crying out loud. She's got it all covered. But to some of the points that Emily was just making there, it really leads me to question, who's better positioned to determine the next steps in micro-credentialing or prior learning? Is it truly the academic institution? And if it is, are we going to be able to remove some of our traditional blinders that we have on? If it's not, then who? Is it the employer? Well, certainly if you're talking on a workforce development slant, that they need to at least be at the table, if not leading the conversation. And then you come back, is it the learner? Because you mentioned the military and reevaluating that there in Virginia, and what is the transferable skill? Maybe you were a medic inside, but you want to get into electronics or IT on the outside, or flip that. And how do you really transfer and translate those skills to the new area? So who's really going to lead that? In some sense, I feel it should be the academic institutions, because that's kind of what we do. But should it always be that way? And are we going to be willing enough as an overall institution to let someone else lead the conversation, and us just sit quietly for a while, listen, take good notes, and then try to help implement it in a meaningful, I love that word, Emily, meaningful way for that learner who's kind of on the sidelines watching the, workforce and employers versus institutions try to figure this out. Then where do we invite them into the conversation? So it's really, how do we get to those next steps, and who's going to lead that?
What's your estimate? How many additional micro-credentials will be added in 2025?
Hard to pin down a number, but again, I think it goes back to some context, as Emily pointed out in her initial comments. What are we calling those micro-credentials? What are they actually? Is it putting a badge on every new short-term workforce program, and or multiple badges within one class of one program, which you absolutely could do. And at that point, it could be exponentially increased. And then I think you have to go a next question beyond that. What is that the right thing to be looking at? Is it really the number of microcredentials that are out there? Or should we start focusing a little more on quality and the value proposition and where it actually places the learner who attains that microcredential? What is it really doing for them? And if we're just playing a numbers game, which I don't think either one of us today have advocated for, and most of the folks in the conversations I've been involved with are not going that route. What are we really doing that adds value for those learners and making sure that we're doing the right thing for the right reasons? But numbers are out there, you're sure, and sometimes that sort of tints our vision a little bit.
And I think the numbers game too, it can be problematic in how we want to deliver to our students, because we also can't overload the system when we're asking faculty to evaluate these things. Because if we're going to add, if there's going to be an additional million added and we're saying we want to be available and have opportunities for every single student, well, that's just not realistic. If we're going to have all of these things done up front, we need to make sure that it makes sense for the college. It makes sense for what they are offering, so that they are kind of a little bit in control of what is going to be coming in to their, to their classroom, who's going to be coming in, because they're going to be prepared. So if you have too many and there are too many certifications and we're overwhelming the system, then we're not going to know that we're not going to be able to properly assess that the students are prepared for the academic rigor of that program. So I think we want to be careful in how many are out there and what it actually looks like for the student. Otherwise, it's just adding all of those extra credits that aren't meaningful and won't be part of their academic program, and could, in the long run, actually even hurt any financial aid, things like that are part of the equation as well.
Yeah. Point. I mean, we can't just put them out there to be putting them out there. Then they become meaningless. They may never get used. You may have a huge resource library of microcredentials, and if you view and then you got to sunset programs or get rid of them because it was never taken advantage of. Most institutions that I've encountered, or at least not to the degree that it's needed, they don't really even have a prior learning department division group. To Emily's point, it falls on those incumbent faculty in the area, and then you're talking release time or you're talking overload, and then it becomes a financial burden as well on the institution. So it's got to be it's got to have an intentionality to it.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I think the labor market piece is so big, because especially if we're talking about adult learners and we're looking at what your local needs are, that labor market is going to be a huge part of the equation for making sure we're evaluating what is going to make sense and offer what is going to make sense for our local needs.
It does come down to a resourcing issue, it feels like, right? Microcredentialing at heart, I think, started to fill a gap and based on affordability and time. And now we're in a kind of a new conundrum of how all of these things fit together to be meaningful. So really appreciated the conversation today. You guys are rock stars. Thank you for everything that you're doing to continue to move prior learning and the recognition of it forward in our ecosystem. And I wish you a great spring semester.